Singapore is known for tough drug laws, which include the death penalty, and recently, the government's biggest target has been vaping. If you come to Singapore, you might see this sort of ad.
What if I told you there's an evil out there that doesn't chase you, but steals your breath? What if I told you
this isn't a movie?
Vapes have long been banned here, but the presence of some vapes with drugs in them prompted authorities to get a lot tougher. Specifically, etomidate, an anesthetic agent usually used in hospitals. If you get caught trafficking a vape with that type of substance in it, you could be jailed or even caned. But vaping in general is now strictly outlawed, with fines, mandatory rehabilitation programs, and a potential criminal record as deterrents. It's a very determined crackdown, but is it proportionate to the problem? Is Singapore leading a broader trend in the region? I'm Mariko in Singapore, and this is Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service. Twice a week, we bring you Asia-Pacific stories, unpacked by those who know them best. And today I have Derek Tsai from our Asia-Pacific podcast team. I also have Tessa Wong, who's a senior journalist with the BBC's news website. Welcome both.
Hi, thank you for having us.
So you're both from Singapore. So let's introduce Singapore's stance on drugs to viewers and listeners who might not be familiar, because it's quite strict. It's one of the strictest in the world, isn't it, Tessa?
Yeah, that's right. We're famously known for our zero tolerance on drugs. What that means is that, drugs that could be possibly acceptable in some countries, like weed, marijuana, that's not allowed in Singapore either. And that also comes with harsh penalties, especially if you get caught trafficking in it. And famously, Singapore has capital punishment. We execute people for crimes. And that also applies to drug traffickers. So, every year or every other year, you will find cases of Singapore executing drug traffickers. That's how serious we are.
And the latest target has been vapes with drugs in them. But let's talk about how vaping became so popular, because, Derek, you used to smoke a cigarette, and then vaping suddenly kind of took off, didn't it? Not just in Asia, but around the world. So tell us why that was.
Yeah, I used to smoke. I don't anymore because I don't like the smell on me, the cigarette smell on me. That's one of the reasons why a lot of my friends who used to smoke turned to vape, because they don't like like when vaping came about. It's popular because it's got fruity flavors, fun flavors, and your fingers don't smell like smoke. Your clothes don't smell like smoke. You don't have to step out of your house or building just to get a hit of nicotine. So that's why a lot of my friends turned to vape. Interestingly, a lot of them, not a lot of them, but some of them eventually quit vaping even before this harsh crackdown that Singapore has enforced, because they said that they realized they vaped a lot more than they used to smoke. So they consumed a lot more nicotine at home, because you can do it from the comfort of your own couch, right? You don't have to leave the building. It's a lot more accessible. It's like, when you're on a diet, you don't want to have snacks at home.
Singapore banned vaping back in 2018. What was the reason behind that, Tessa?
So at that time, the official rationale that they gave was that, look, the jury is out on whether vaping is bad for you long term, but we're not going to take any chances. We're going to ban it first. And that's a very typical Singaporean approach, a Singaporean government approach, when in doubt, let's stop, let's think about it, and let's prevent it first before we can figure out what to do with it.
So in 2018, were they already talking about vapes with drugs in them, or were they just simply banning vaping just as a precautionary measure?
The latter. Back then, vapes with drugs, that wasn't a phenomenon that, the way that we've seen it now globally, not just in Singapore. Back then it was just purely on the science and the medical science of vaping and its effect on human health. So at that time, there was still a lot of discussion about whether it's actually worse than cigarette smoking, and whether, intrinsically it could also harm your health. And back then, the science and the research wasn't the same as what we've seen now.
I think the prevailing theory is that it's still inconclusive in some countries, and even to the World Health Organization, right? Because it's such an emerging technology, and we don't know what the long-term effects of vapes are. It could be worse than cigarettes. We don't know that.
There has been more research that has kind of shown that there could be long-term health effects caused by vaping. It's not like vaping is completely clean no matter what the vaping industry might want to portray, there are side effects to that. And so the WHO, the US CDC, these health authorities have said that there are some side effects and health effects of vaping. To them, I think they both say that there needs to be more long-term research on whether this is actually harmful in itself. But Singapore has made up its mind. It's really just said it is more harmful or as harmful as cigarettes. We're going to stop it.
But then why don't they ban cigarettes as well? If we're talking about if they're worried about nicotine addiction and the impact on health.
So I think someone has asked the health minister this question a few months ago. His answer was, basically what the Singapore government has been saying in the last few months, which is that to them, they believe vaping is a lot more addictive than cigarette smoking, which is what you were saying, right? Because, you can be puffing away on your vape all day and you wouldn't have realized that you've kind of puffed away at maybe 20 times more than what you have normally smoked if you were going through cigarettes. So that was the rationale. But I also think, in that answer, that's the official answer, you can kind of see how the Singapore government has kind of accepted, as has every country in the world, that cigarette smoking is a vice that is here to stay. And when you've got a vice like that is so, baked into society and societal habits, if you try to ban it completely, you're just going to end up driving it underground. What's happened is vaping has become a drug issue for Singapore, and that is a red line for the Singapore government. As you say, as we talked about earlier, it's a zero tolerance policy towards drugs in Singapore, and so when you've got drugs involved, they've got to go hard on it as well. That's their rationale. We've also got really harsh penalties that have been rolled out, including caning in some very rare instances. For people who get caught smuggling in vapes with drugs.
So you mentioned caning. That's a very foreign concept to many of our viewers and listeners who aren't familiar with the rules in Singapore. Can you just tell us a bit more about that?
So caning in Singapore is basically flogging. They use a very large rattan cane and they use it to whip the buttocks of a convict. And it can be quite painful, and that's usually reserved for the gravest of punishments in Singapore, which is, among them is drug trafficking.
So we're talking about, when it comes to vaping, we're talking about trafficking, selling of those drugs-laced vapes that would potentially result in caning by the authorities. How are local Singaporeans, especially those who shifted to vaping from smoking a cigarette, how have they been reacting to this crackdown on vaping, Derek?
Yeah, I spoke to a lot of them, and some of them have quit vaping post crackdown 2025 crackdown because they think that it's way too much trouble to get vapes now, and they don't want to seem like renegades on the streets. Some I've spoken to say that they are adamant about not quitting and have really, really strong opinions about why the government is doing this because, well, two things. One, a lot of them ask, why did they not just enforce this crackdown properly in 2018? Which is the question I want to ask you, Tessa, what your assessment is. And second, they don't like the idea of being grouped together with people who smoke drug-laced vapes, which is a really small percentage of the population of people who vape in Singapore.
What's been the reaction from Singaporeans, especially people who started vaping, shifting from smoking a cigarette, as you mentioned?
I spoke to one of them and who agreed to be interviewed, and this is what he said.
In this country, we have so few luxuries already, you know what I mean? And to me, vaping is just another nicotine product, just like cigarettes and all that. It's one of the few luxuries that I choose to have, And I don't think it's right for the government to strong-arm me into quitting this, I compare vaping and smoking. I feel like vaping is better for me. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to think for myself and not let the government dictate what I can and cannot do. I don't think it should be illegal in that sense, They are forcing it on us, and I don't like it. It's lazy, this blanket ban on vapes. You allow cigarettes, but you don't allow vapes. And they did a very poor job of addressing why they did this,
So the fact that you had to blur his face and change his voice, that's not something we would have had to do to a vapor in any other countries but Singapore. But it's also making me wonder, how does he get hold of a vape in Singapore, especially since that crackdown?
Look, like any other vice that you ban in a country, whether it's Singapore or Thailand or Malaysia, once you ban something, you drive it underground, people can still find things that they want to find. I spoke to a supplier and I asked the supplier if it's been more difficult getting vapes into Singapore, and they said that it's not, and they're just being a lot more careful now. So I guess this is where these suppliers are where who these people are getting the vapes from.
Is such an underground market common in Singapore with vapes or with any other drugs?
Common as in
Like, can you get drugs in Singapore even though it has the capital punishment?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's been a well known fact that you can always get drugs. And periodically they do drug busts in Singapore.
Mm.
Yeah. So it always shows it's a vice still, right? So you can
Mm.
still get it. But I guess the way, in terms of like drug culture, the way it's perceived in the mainstream in Singapore, it's very different from, say, other countries which have more relaxed views of it. And that's because of this very sort of like active suppression and, strict rules of drugs in Singapore.
I have a question for you, Tessa. Do you think, what's your assessment on why did the government not enforce the ban in 2018? Why now?
Yeah. I think it's quite clear what's happened. Back then they basically said that, they made it clear at that point of time that they're not really sure whether vaping is bad, right? So we're just going to ban it as a precaution first. And I think from what we could see, how it played out in the following years was that they seemed to, basically not be cracking down very hard on it. We talked about it, right, before taping this show. I would have seen people vaping on the streets, maybe not like very openly, but you could definitely see people vaping. And it wasn't such a taboo thing. But now what's happened is that drugs have entered the picture. Drugs have actually entered these devices, and so when they say we're going to treat it as a drug issue, that's why they've decided to clamp down so hard on it.
And then there's the debate between regulating and banning, right? Because when you ban it, you drive things underground. That's when drugs find their way into these pods. Because if you had regulated it from the start, and only regulated suppliers or shops can sell it, then you will be able to know what are the ingredients that go into the pot.
And the Singapore government has really put a lot of effort into, I guess, shifting the Singaporeans' mindset when it comes to vaping, haven't they? We want to show some of those posters that are everywhere in Singapore now on a public transport, movie theaters, and so on. And for those listening, this one shows a guy on a hospital bed with tubes coming out of him with the line "Final Destination ICU." And another one says Breaking Dad, a play on a show Breaking Bad about drugs. And I remember this one, Derek, because I first saw it on a bus with my child. And it's a very kind of horrific looking, scary looking father in dark, kind of red and blue, almost, trying to give a very dramatic effect to people, commuters who are actually looking at those posters.
Yeah, very dramatic. I mean, very dramatic, but I think also very smart. And I think it also tells you the demographic that the government is trying to get to, because Danger Things, played on the show Stranger Things, Breaking Dad, and Final Destination. Like these are all shows that
Pop culture.
Pop culture, exactly. Millennials, we all watch, and Gen Zs. So it's very telling of who the government's trying to reach with these messages. But for me, and I guess for you also, Tessa, we grew up having that message embedded into us from a very young age that drugs are bad, right? So I find it dramatic and smart, but not entirely unusual for the Singapore government.
When it comes to vaping, Singapore isn't actually alone, is it, in terms of banning it? So, Derek, can you just talk us through what other governments in Asia are doing?
In Thailand, in Vietnam, it's banned. But even though it's banned, you can still find vapes in those countries because it's not enforced well. There are varying degrees of enforcement in those countries. In Indonesia, it's not banned at all. In Malaysia, funnily enough, right after Singapore cracked down on vaping last year in 2025, the intense enforcement, a couple of weeks later, Malaysia came up to say that by 2026, they want to phase out all vapes. and I had a friend who just went to JB Johor, the nearest state to Singapore, where a lot of Singaporeans go to. He said that you can't find vapes in 7-Eleven or convenience stores anymore, but he still saw people vaping on the streets.
So I guess it's not just Singapore, but a lot of Asian governments have decided that vaping isn't good for people's health and therefore trying to ban it or at least regulate it. But do you think this kind of campaign, especially in Singapore, do you think it's sustainable? Because all these ads, all these, you know, rays and everything else, that can't be that cheap. So how much longer do you think the Singapore government would keep doing this?
I mean, that's the question. I mean, I personally believe that once the heat sort of dies down a bit, it's going to be something that you will still see happening, you know, on the fringes, on the sides. You know, just this weekend, I saw someone vaping. I was driving, you know, through an industrial area, and I saw someone just vaping outside his office building. It was a Saturday, so maybe he felt that no one was going to see him. You saw someone too, right?
Yeah. So I was just gonna say, it's I think like you, it's never been about eradicating vapes. At least that's what my opinion. It's about minimalizing people who vape.
Yeah.
And since the enforcement last year, I want to say around August, was it?
September.
September. For a couple of months, I saw no one vaping on the streets. But today, coming back from lunch to the office, I saw someone vaping openly out in public, and I was shocked. Not because of someone vaping. I was shocked because, you know, I thought the crackdown was still happening, but I guess it's sort of
Yeah.
subsided a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, in September, they even launched a hotline where people can call in if they saw vapor.
Yeah.
I don't know. And then they reportedly received thousands of reports then. I don't know if people are actively dobbing people in now the way that they might have. But I think the whole idea anyway was to kind of just drum in the message into the population to get it into our minds that it is bad. And so don't do it.
I think Singapore can do it well only because like it's got a very socially engineered public. But in places like Thailand, Malaysia, I'm not sure if they can properly enforce it.
I mean, it's not that hard also because Singapore has already a lot of rules and regulations, right? We ban a lot of drugs. We get very tough on all these things. So it's just one more thing to add to the list. But I think all the sort of like day-to-day policing that they have been doing since September, that takes up a lot of effort and resources that we might see less of. It's going to be a lot more of the sort of like step back state kind of policing that we're going to see going forward. That's my take anyway.
I mean, that's why we saw people vaping out in public.
Yeah, and I think people kind of
Okay.
twig onto that as well. Yeah.
Well, as you say, if there's one country which can enforce this ban and strict penalties on vaping, it will be Singapore, and we'll see whether other countries would follow. Thank you both, Derek and Tessa.
Thank
Thank you.
You've been watching Asia Pacific from the BBC World Service with me, Marika Oi, in Singapore. If you have any questions or thoughts on what we've covered in this episode or any other stories from the region, please leave us a comment below. You can also get in touch with us on email, asiapacific@bbc.co.uk. And click like and subscribe so you never miss an episode. See you next time.
Bye.